The sirens had long faded. The dust still lingered. Rachel stood motionless, barefoot on what used to be her living room floor, now a mosaic of shattered glass, broken bricks, and the charred remains of a life that no longer existed. She wasn't crying. Not because she wasn't broken, but because even the tears had given up. The storm had taken everything: her home, her job, and worst of all, her sense of direction. She was 38, recently divorced, and had just moved back to her hometown in the Midwest to start over. But no one ever tells you how starting over can sometimes feel worse than never starting at all. The tornado that hit the outskirts of Willow Creek 2 days ago hadn't made national news, just another minor incident in rural America. But to Rachel, it was the final blow in a long string of silent collapses. She wandered back to the ruins each morning, searching for something, anything, that might resemble a reason to keep going. A photo, a journal, her grandmother's locket, a memory, a sign. That morning, just as the sun pierced through the gray clouds, she heard a whimper. Soft, faint, definitely alive. She froze. It came from underneath a collapsed beam near where the couch used to be. She climbed over a pile of debris, heart racing, legs trembling. Not from fear, but from a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Rachel dropped to her knees, peeling back layers of insulation and cracked wood, guided by the sound. And then she saw it. A puppy, tiny, mud-covered, shivering. One of his ears stood straight up, the other drooped. He had a patch of white fur around his left eye, like someone had brushed it on with a cloud. He didn't bark, he didn't flinch. He just looked at her like he'd been waiting all along. And that's when something inside Rachel cracked. Not in the way things break, but in the way seeds break open before they bloom. She wrapped him in the only piece of fabric she could find, her old flannel jacket, and whispered, "Hey buddy, it's okay now, I've got you." The wind picked up again, tossing leaves and dust across the ruins, as if the world itself were sighing. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Rachel felt needed. Not pitied, not judged, just needed. And she had no idea then that this muddy little creature with mismatched ears would soon lead her to something buried much deeper than rubble, something she never expected to find. But first, she had to survive the weight of the past and figure out if she was ready to live again. Have you ever found something or someone just when you needed it most? Tell us in the comments. Your story might inspire someone else who's waiting for a sign. She named him Dusty, not just because of the grime covering his tiny body when she found him, but because he looked like he'd been swept out from the forgotten corners of the world. Like her, a little misplaced, a little broken, but still holding on. The first few nights, they slept in her car. The house was too far gone to offer shelter, and the local emergency centers were already packed with families. She turned the back seat into a makeshift den, an old fleece blanket she found in the trunk, a backpack as a pillow, and Dusty curled up tightly against her chest. Every time the wind rattled the trees or a branch creaked in the night, he whimpered, pressing his trembling body closer to hers. Rachel barely slept, not because she was afraid, but because something in her had shifted. For months, maybe years, she'd been moving through life like a shadow, eating without tasting, waking without dreaming. But now, there was this tiny creature depending on her. Dusty didn't speak, didn't ask questions, didn't remind her of her failures. He just followed her, quietly, faithfully, as if he knew she was as lost as he was. During the day they wandered, she returned to the wreckage of her house, not looking for anything specific anymore, just feeling tethered to the spot where everything had come undone. Dusty would trot behind her, occasionally sniffing a broken dish or climbing onto a piece of wood as if to say, "We're still here." One morning, while digging through a bin of clothing donations outside the community hall, she met Margaret, an older woman with a wide-brimmed hat and eyes that smiled even when her mouth didn't. "Soup's hot," Margaret said, motioning toward a small portable stove set up next to a folding table. "And you look like you haven't had something warm in days." Rachel hesitated, then sat. Dusty lay down beneath her chair without a sound. Margaret studied the puppy and then looked at Rachel with a gentle curiosity. "That one chose you," she said. Rachel blinked. "What do you mean?" Margaret smiled softly. "You lost your house, maybe even your way. But that little guy didn't just survive a storm, he found you in it. That's not nothing, sweetheart. Sometimes we don't rescue them, they rescue us." Rachel didn't respond. She just stared at the steam rising from her cup, thinking about all the ways she had quietly disappeared from herself over the past few years, and how Dusty, without even trying, was slowly helping her return. Later that afternoon, she walked back to her ruined home. Dusty paused near the porch and began to dig, claws scraping at something just beneath the dirt. Curious, Rachel knelt beside him and helped brush away the soil. It was a photo, water-stained, edges curled, but still intact. Her and her brother, smiling. On the front, steps of that very house taken 20 years ago. She hadn't thought of him in a long time, and somehow Dusty had found the memory she didn't know she needed. The days that followed felt like scenes from someone else's life. Gray, slow, uncertain. But Rachel moved through them with a strange sense of purpose. Each morning, Dusty would nudge her awake with his cold nose, tail thumping, eyes wide with the kind of hope she hadn't felt in years. They had nothing, but somehow having each other made it enough. She began volunteering at the community supply station. At first, it was just to pass time, to fold clothes, hand out bottled water, sweep the dusty floors. But with Dusty always at her side, people noticed her, talked to her, smiled at her. A child offered Dusty a cracker. A teenager asked to pet him. An old man gave her a folding chair and called her kiddo, even though she was pushing 40. It was small, but it was something. After years of being invisible, she felt seen. One afternoon, a volunteer named Maya invited Rachel to join a rebuilding team for a neighborhood on the edge of town. "It's mostly cleanup now," she said, brushing sweat from her brow. "But we could use someone who knows their way around a hammer." Rachel hesitated. "I haven't picked up a hammer in 10 years, Maya grinned. "Neither has half the crew. That's what makes it fun." And just like that, Rachel said yes. Each swing of the hammer was oddly therapeutic. She drove out rusted nails, tore down soggy drywall, and helped stack new boards for homes not yet born again. Dusty stayed close, often lying under the shade of a tarp, watching her with that same steady gaze. It was in those moments, covered in dust, sweat, and the scent of fresh-cut wood, that Rachel began to feel real again. Not the version of her that had dissolved in grief, but the woman she was before the silence, before the loss. She remembered laughter. She remembered what it felt like to ache from effort, not from emptiness. And Dusty? He thrived. He grew stronger, bolder. His ribs no longer showed. His fur was clean, warm in the sun. He made friends with the other volunteers, especially a boy named Owen, who had lost his family's home but found joy in tossing a ball that Dusty always returned, tail wagging, tongue out, completely free. Rachel started keeping a notebook again. At night, she scribbled down pieces of her day, things she hadn't done since her brother passed. Observations, conversations, little things. Dusty did. It became a ritual, like brushing her teeth or folding her coat just so. Then one night something shifted. She and Dusty were returning from the work site when he stopped in his tracks, his ears perked, his nose twitching, and then he ran. Not toward danger, but toward something. Rachel called after him, heart pounding, flashlight beam bouncing as she chased him across the uneven ground. He disappeared behind a half-fallen shed, and when she reached him, he was barking. Loud, frantic, being at the base of the wall. Rachel knelt beside him, brushing aside leaves and debris, and there it was. A low moan. A man. Trapped beneath the wreckage. Alive. Dusty had found him. Rachel gasped, reaching for her phone with trembling hands. "Hang on," she whispered more to Dusty than anyone else. "We're gonna get help. What would you do if your dog led you straight to a life hanging by a thread?" Would you follow? Would you trust? Let me know in the comments. The emergency team arrived. Within minutes, the man, barely conscious, dehydrated, and pinned under a collapsed wooden beam, was rushed to the local triage center. His name was Caleb, a contractor who had come back to salvage tools from his old workshop and hadn't made it out before the floor caved in. He wouldn't have lasted another night, a paramedic told Rachel as they loaded him into the ambulance. Your dog saved his life. She looked down at Dusty. He was muddy, panting, tail still wagging as if none of it were a big deal. But it was. It was everything. That night, Rachel sat in the tent she'd started sleeping in near the volunteer base. Dusty curled into her lap, his soft snoring the only sound. She stared up at the stars, her heart pounding, not with fear, but with something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Pride, the kind that wraps around your chest and makes you feel taller, braver, like maybe you're not just surviving anymore. Over the next few days, Dusty became something of a local hero. Volunteers began calling him Little Guardian. Kids drew pictures of him. Someone even made him a vest that said Rescue Crew. He wore it like it had always been his purpose. Rachel kept working, but more than that, she started leading. She organized rebuilding efforts, helped families find missing documents, sat with teenagers who didn't know how to grieve what they'd lost. Her voice, once so quiet, now filled rooms with calm and direction. One afternoon, Caleb returned to the site, limping but alive. He walked straight to Rachel, holding something in his hand. A small hand-carved wooden figurine of a dog. It's not much, he said, eyes misty, but it's for him, for Dusty, for saving me, and for bringing me back to my daughter. Rachel took it gently, her throat tight. Thank you, she whispered. Dusty licked Caleb's hand. Then came the moment that shifted everything. A news outlet picked up the story. Not just the rescue, but the bond. A woman who lost her home and herself, finding you, meaning again through the eyes of a street puppy. Footage of Dusty's rescue went viral. Comments poured in, messages of hope, offers of support, donations. People sharing their own stories of being saved, by animals, by strangers, by moments they never expected. Rachel watched the interview clip for the first time on a borrowed phone. When they asked her what changed her life, she didn't even hesitate. A dog who found me when I didn't know I was lost, she said, voice calm, and showed me how to live again. 6 months later, the town looked nothing like the ruins Rachel had first wandered into. The roads were cleaner. Houses stood upright, painted in soft yellows and blues. The scent of fresh bread floated from a reopened bakery, and wind chimes clinked on porches where silence once reigned. But perhaps the most beautiful change wasn't made of brick or wood. It was in the way people looked at each other, openly, gently, as if they knew the value of connection now, of second chances. Rachel had moved into a small, refurbished home near the park, not far from where she and Dusty had first slept under the stars. The house wasn't fancy, 2 rooms, creaky floors, but it was hers, her own space, her own story. And Dusty had a bed of his own too, right beside hers, though he still preferred to curl up at her feet. Every morning she and Dusty walked through the neighborhood. Kids waved. Neighbors greeted her with smiles that felt earned, not just polite, and she started writing. Again, not in torn notebooks, but on a laptop donated by someone who had seen her story online. Her memoir, still in its early chapters, was called The Dog Who Rescued Me Back. She didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that she had something to say again. One afternoon, Rachel sat at a rebuilt gazebo with Dusty asleep at her side, watching the sun dip below the hills. Maya sat next to her, sipping coffee from a tin cup. You ever think you'd get here? Maya asked, nodding toward the horizon. Rachel smiled, slow and sure. Not even in my best dreams. And maybe that was the real miracle. Not the rescue, not the virality, but the quiet rebuilding of a woman who had given up on her future, and found it in a dog who refused to let her go. Dusty stirred, nose twitching. His eyes met hers, and in that simple, steady gaze, Rachel saw everything she had once lost, and everything she had found again. Hope, home, herself. If Rachel and Dusty's journey touched your heart, hit the like button. It's a small cheer for every soul finding light again. Subscribe to the Overcoming Stories and join our family of dreamers. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that connection heals. What has rescued you in your darkest hour? Drop your story in the comments. Let's grow together.